Wichita State University, and I'd like to welcome you to today's CAUSE Teaching and Learning webinar. We're pleased to have as our presenters today Kristen Roland, who is a PhD student and graduate research assistant at the University of Georgia, and Dr. Jennifer Kaplan, who is an associate professor also at the University of Georgia. For today's webinar, they will give a presentation entitled Initial Findings about Graduate Teaching Assistants' Training Needs to Foster Active Learning in Statistics. The way the webinars work is that all listeners are muted during the webinar. You can ask questions at any time by typing them into the questions box. We'll be sure to ask those questions towards the end and give the presenters a chance to respond. You can also use the chat box at any time if you are having any technical questions. At this point, I'll turn things over to Ms. Roland. Kristen, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for joining us. And I'm presenting this work in conjunction with Jennifer Kaplan. So before I get started on telling you about some of our results that we found for our graduate teaching assistants' needs to foster active learning in statistics, I want to give you a little bit of an understanding of where we started and how this project kind of came into existence. So about 2 years ago when we started our project, we realized that there hadn't been any course improvement in our Introductory Statistics course since before the GAISE College Report back in 2005. In fact, we estimate that it hadn't been updated in about 10 to 15 years at that point. So this really started as we needed to understand what was happening in our labs, what our undergraduate students were doing, and what our graduate students were doing. We also needed to figure out what content was being covered in our lab and what our GTAs were doing in our lab. And so I will explain what our course outline looks like in just a second, but our GTAs were in our labs and they were very much procedural. They were very much point and click, and our GTAs did anything from spend 5 minutes going over the answers to the lab questions and then use that time as homework time, to anything where they would lecture for about 20 minutes, go over the problems for the lab, and then that was all the students were getting in terms of course content. And so when we started this project, we really decided that the motto for this project is really evolution, not revolution. And so we knew that we needed to improve and bring our course up to meet the college report, but we really wanted to start small, and we wanted to focus our attention on something that we could really make a large impact on. And so that is focusing our attention on our 1-hour lab component for our course. And so since we wanted to put our attention to there, that also begged the question, what did we need to understand in order to help our GTAs facilitate these new activities and to bring up their teaching skills and meet their needs to implement our GAISE College Report? And so before we move into our research project, I want you to really understand what STAT 2000 looks like here, our intro STAT course looks like here at UGA. And so we teach about 1,200 students each semester in fall and spring, with about 200 students in the summer. It's a 4-credit course, and it meets 3 hours per week in lectures of 200 to 250, with the exception of one small lecture, which is taught by a graduate teaching assistant of 35. And the 4th hour of our course is met in a computer lab of there's 30 students seats in this class in the classroom, but we always have issues with technology, so we cap it at 28. And so our course is actually very well coordinated. There's one course coordinator who's a senior faculty member, and she dictates the content. She makes her slides available for the lecturers, which are typically taught by faculty, and the faculty are about 2 to 5. And so the lectures are given to the faculty, and they can modify them as they see fit. The calendar, the homework assignments, the lab activities, and all of their exams are all common across all of the sections. All of our labs are taught by GTAs, and there are about 10 to 12 of them each semester. And
10 to 12 GTAs.
Yes, 10 to 12 GTAs per semester. And our semester here is 15 weeks. The way the course is set up is that they take their exams during the lab sections. So there's 3 weeks for testing, so that leaves us about 12 weeks to actually give a lab lesson. And so with all of this in mind, this is what created our research project. And so our research project is called FALSR, which stands for Fostering Active Learning in Statistics Research. And it technically has 3 goals. The first is to create and implement activities for use in an intro stat course. We've already done that. The second one is to document changes in our student learning that's associated with our activities. And the third one is the one I'm going to actually really talk to you about today, which is what needs we've started to figure out that our GTAs need with respect to knowledge of content and pedagogy to facilitate these activities in the classroom. But before I talk about what needs they need for their knowledge of content and pedagogy for these activities, I want to talk a little bit about what these activities were that we have designed that we're asking our GTAs to work on. And so out of the 6 GAISE recommendations, we really decided, so again, the motto was evolution, not revolution.
Kristen, we seem to have lost your audio. I'm not sure what happened. Can anyone hearing the broadcast hear either me or Kristen? Is anyone else having audio issues? Okay, Kristen, we seem to have lost your audio. Perhaps you could call in using the phone.
What? Can you hear us?
Yes, now we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry. We have no idea what happened, but we're going with it.
Okay, so maybe start over on this slide here. When you cut out, you were talking about what you were going to focus on in terms of the evolution and not the revolution.
Okay, so I was saying that where we wanted to implement all of the GAISE recommendations, we were focusing on just improving our lab section. So we had 1 hour, and so we were focusing on evolution, not revolution, and we chose the middle 3 GAISE recommendations to focus on in our changing of our lab activities. And so we really wanted to change the labs from being very procedural about conceptual understanding. We wanted to integrate real data with a context and purpose, and we wanted to be able to foster active learning. And so I want to talk about a little bit about what we meant and how we did that in our labs. And so by conceptual understanding, we've really made sure that in each of our labs there's a
And we've lost your audio again. I'm so sorry. I don't know what's happening.
Am I back?
Yes.
That's that one.
All right. Can you hear us?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the what we mean by conceptual understanding in our labs. And so we've devoted whole labs to the interpretation of confidence intervals. So for example, we really wanted them to understand what the interpretation of a confidence level was and how that implemented and how that crossed over to the interpretation of a confidence level. And then we also have a whole lab that's dedicated to the interpretation of a p-value. By active learning, we mean that we have really tried to make sure that group work is an active part in each of our labs. We have set up little scenarios so that each group can work through a set of problems. We have a lot of, particularly for our proportion labs, we have bead boxes, and so there's some tactile work that we do before we go over to an applet so that they really understand what the applet is doing. And by real data, we've taken student responses from previous semesters' surveys that we've given them, and we use that data and analyze that within our lessons. And we also have some simulated data from a real population that we use for our labs as well. And so with all of that, that requires different skill sets than our GTAs were used to doing. And so when we went to go figure out how to create a professional development program and to figure out how to train our TAs to do these things, we went to the literature. And so we found that there was sparse literature. There's lots of literature about faculty development, professional development, but there's very little about GTAs. And so what we did know was that some of the professional development from faculty could translate to our GTAs. And some of those are that they like coordinated and focused professional development. It needs to last over an extended period of time. We need to provide instructors with evidence of a problem. And most importantly, we have to respect the expertise of the instructors. And that's the same for GTAs as well. We have to allow our GTAs to be able to reinvent some of the things that we're telling them. We have to provide a collective community to share the approaches and to reflect on those practices, but also be able to provide feedback that's not only on the change, but also on the student learning outcomes. And so some of that did end up applying to our GTAs, but there's also some different things that we have to understand about statistics GTAs. They have strong theoretical background, but often their knowledge isn't developed in a way that they can explain conceptually their theoretical knowledge. So they have a strong theoretical knowledge, but often weak conceptual knowledge. We also, most of us acknowledge that most of them have never actually taken an intro stat course. Their first stat course is usually math stat. And so those are very different skill sets than what we're asking them to use in our intro stat course. And they often want to improve their instruction, but most importantly, they want really clear guidelines on their content. And so this has been a 2-year process, and so we have had lots of things that we have learned, and we have made lots of changes. And so here's some of the things that we have learned and some of the changes we've started to make. And then I'll tell you a little bit about what we're actually doing now. And so some of the bigger things that we found is definitely autonomy. So GTAs, that have come in, particularly the GTAs that came in that had taught the semester before we made all these changes, and the GTAs that have teaching experience, they want their own autonomy. They want to be able to take what we're doing and implement it in their own way. But those GTAs that are brand new, which we actually get about half of our GTAs coming in the fall, are brand new GTAs. They actually prefer to have a little bit more guidance. So there's finding that balance between autonomy and giving guidance to the new GTAs. In addition, we also found that our GTAs had some pedagogical issues, such as pacing. One of the biggest things we found out is that our labs were very short at the very beginning, and we've lengthened them. And as a result, we haven't lengthened the class time, but we've lengthened the activity. And so that requires the GTA to really understand how to pace a course. The bigger problem is that a lot of GTAs just let the activity end. They never tried to close it. They didn't try to wrap up what the students had learned, never tried to connect it back to lecture in any way, shape, or form. So we had to really work on figuring out how to help GTAs figure out how to do closure. We found out that discussion of lab content and how it connected to lecture was very important. A lot of our GTAs had never taken the course that they were teaching, and we don't require them to go to lecture to find out what that requires. So really making that connection was important. As I said, we use WebAssign, which is our classroom management system, and it's online. And we found that our students, our undergraduate students, the second that they got the password to get in to do the lab assignment, stopped paying attention to the TAs, and the TAs were upset about that. And so we really made sure that we gave them hard copies of all of the activities. And so we've now moved that the GTAs work through the activities with the students on paper before they have to go to WebAssign, and they do a sample assessment on WebAssign, which is not part of our activities. We've also figured out how readings are beneficial, and reading sample student responses have also helped our GTAs understand where misconceptions are. One of the biggest lessons we've learned is that we have to emphasize the conceptual aspects of the lab. Oftentimes, if we don't, then the GTAs will, they find these questions the most difficult questions of the lab, and so they'll either try to answer these questions very procedurally, or they won't give them the time that they are due. And so that kind of leads into the last bullet, which is the importance of working through the lab, and there's pros and cons. Our GTAs really like that they get the lab demoed to them. The con of that is there's a time constraint to that. So if our labs are 50 minutes and we try to demo a lab in its entirety and really focus on the conceptual aspects of lab, it's longer than we have an hour to do the training and a 50-minute lab. And so if we try to demo the entire lab, we don't have any time to talk about it, to debrief about it. And so what ended up happening is when we would demo the lab, it would become a very procedural demonstration, which is what the TAs would take and implement in their course. And so we actually have evidence of how that's a pro and a con, and we think we might have worked on a way of kind of helping that out. And so this is what we ended up doing, and this is the implementation that we're using currently. So we, there's a group of 3 of us, myself, Kim Gilbert, who is our course coordinator, and Krista Baranyak, who is another GTA on the project. We meet weekly to plan the training session that we use, that the GTAs attend. And so at that meeting, we discuss how training should go, what things we should focus on, what problems did I see this semester before, problems with either the students' misconceptions or timing issues. And then when we meet with the GTAs, we have about an hour meeting. And at that meeting, we summarize the key concepts of the lab. We go over the important points of the lab. We talk about timing. We will demonstrate the lab. We identify possible issues. We ask the GTAs to help identify possible issues. We discuss readings. We ask previous GTAs to talk about their experiences with the lab. We really make those explicit connections between the questions in lab and lecture. And then, as I said, the most important thing that we learned is that we need to emphasize those conceptual ideas because they don't get developed otherwise. And so we've figured out all of this by the data that we have collected. So we have data that backs all this up. Weekly, we ask our GTAs to take a survey that's based on their affect and feedback on their lab. And we've used that to help us update training and update the lab activities. We also I observe the training session, and I take notes during that. I also take, and I observe 6 of our GTAs a week using COPUS, which I'll talk about in a second. And per semester, we've met with our GTAs twice in a focus group. We take pre and post content knowledge and pedagogical knowledge from our GTAs as well. And so with all of that, I would like to show you some of the results of how our active learning activities have been implemented in the course and how we've come up with some of our conclusions. And so to do that, I'm going to do that visually using COPUS, which is an observation protocol that focuses primarily on documenting active learning in a classroom. And so these are the instructor codes. This is essentially fake data for me to explain to you what the graph is demonstrating, and then I'll show you the results in a second. So these are the possible instructor codes. So when I'm in a classroom in 2-minute segments, I record what our GTA is doing. So are they lecturing? Are they demoing on the computer? Are they writing, walking around the classroom, answering questions? And so you'll notice that the darker red, it's a presentation. We would ideally like this to be minimized. We would ideally like the guiding section, which is the lighter red, to be a little bit longer. And for the purpose of this, our other category is essentially when there's dead time. This is most noticeable in fall of 2015 when the labs were too short. And so here's the results from the last 4 semesters. And so again, in fall, our activities were very short, and so we have a lot of other. And so you can see in spring of 2016, we went through our first set of revisions of the activity. And so the first thing you can notice is we have extended the our labs, but the proportions seem to be about the same, just that we've extended the length of time that we're doing an activity. We had a major revision of our activities between spring 2016 and fall 2016. And this is where we really noticed that if we tried to demo the lab in its entirety, and we ended up focusing purely on the procedural, and all of a sudden our presenting time was well over 50%, almost 75% of the time in the classroom was that the TA was presenting. And we have attributed that to the fact that we tried to be really procedural in our demonstration. And so in spring, we really cut back. We don't demo the lab. Most of our GTAs are experienced GTAs. And instead, we really focus on trying to develop that conceptual understanding, develop those conceptual questions, and having the GTA be confident that they don't have to lecture through this material, that the students can work their way through it. And so you notice that the presenting has come down. We are doing a lot more guiding in our classroom, and this is exactly what we were hoping for it to happen. And so I have similar graphs for the students. They have slightly different categories, but again, red is receiving, so they're being fairly passive. The lighter red is working, so again, we want to see a lot of that, a lot of talking to class. And again, the other is more of a dead time, that they're not working and doing things in the classroom. And so again, our results from the last 4 semesters. So again, you can see that we've lengthened the length of time between fall and spring. We are, and again, the proportions kind of stayed the same. The same trend happened in fall 2016, where they were being very passive for a lot of their time. And then we have hopefully started to figure out some of the fix for that in spring 2017, and they're doing a lot less receiving, a lot more working and talking amongst themselves, which is what we are hoping for. And so our future directions, we would like to continue our research on our GTAs and our students. By doing that, we would like to collect more data, actually analyze the data that we've collected, really look to see if there's been changes in the GTA content knowledge and pedagogical knowledge, as well as changes in the student content knowledge. We would like to also be able to follow up with some clinical interviews, case studies of individual GTAs, and we would like to work on dissemination, so really trying to get all of this out. And so thank you very much. We would also like to thank all of our GTAs here at the UGA. I'd like to also thank Dr. Kim Gilbert, Kristen Varniak, Victoria Weber, Roger Woodard, and again, this was, the jury was funded by an NSF grant.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing this with us. Are there any questions from attendees that you'd like me to ask to Kristen? Give some people a minute to type those up if they have them. And we mentioned earlier you guys are presenting this in a couple of posters at US COTS next month, so those of you who are going to be there, you might want to look this up. Elena is asking, how do you access the labs? Are they graded individually, or do they get participation points without grading their work? I think assess, not assess the labs. Sorry, I said that wrong.
They get they have to answer about 3 to 5 sample assessments. If there's 5 of them, then 4 of them are typically multiple choice, numeric responses, and then there's typically 1 open-ended response per lab. Ideally, we would like those to be graded, but with 1,200 responses, we haven't quite figured out the manpower here at the university on how to actually read those to give timely feedback.
But they don't get credit for the activity.
But they don't get, yes, they don't get credit for the actual activity. They only get credit for the WebAssign portion, and they can only do WebAssign in the classroom that the lab took place in, and it's password and IP protected.
So they take like a little quiz at the end of the lab on your,
the students have to show up to be able to log in to the sample assessment.
Right. Okay.
So they get, I mean, there's participation because they have to show up, and then they do the lab assignment at the end.
Okay.
But there's no grading on the actual activity itself.
Okay. Well, I, for one, am very interested to see further results and also to see some of these labs, so I'm hoping you get that push out going pretty quickly there, and wish you guys luck on this project. It sounds very, very interesting.
So we have 2 posters at US COTS. One will be more about the activities, and one will be more about the TA results. And we also are doing a workshop on Thursday afternoon, bringing together people who are involved in training TAs to talk about how other people train TAs and what we can learn as a community together and how we can sort of move forward. So, and we'll have some copies. We actually have the labs in a lab manual that's now published, and we will have some of those with us as well at US COTS for anybody who's there.
That sounds great. So if you didn't have a good reason to go to US COTS before, now we certainly do. Thanks again for presenting to us today, and thanks to all of you for attending. We'll look forward to seeing you next month, and hope everyone has a good day.